a basis of promise neighborhoods today with the federal government or the Social Innovation Fund. They've been doing it for years, but what do we know about picking good sites? Has anybody written a treatise on that? The third challenge is that foundation funding or any really single source of funding can sometimes distort nonprofit projects, and it shields them from market feedback and having to make the sale on an idea, on an approach to a broader market. Now, this kind of problem cuts both ways. We do need flexible upfront money to shelter projects as they get off so they can percolate. At the same time, we need to expose them to critical thinking, because unless they have that, and market feedback from real customers is one way that happens, they're not going to get off the ground. I won't tell the story now, maybe I'll come back to it, but I have a great example of a project called the Austin Labor Force Intermediary Project that Casey and a number of other funders did in Chicago with Shorebank. And it was a complicated model, all foundation funded. It made all these mistakes. No convincing feasibility study. The funds were cut in half, and there still wasn't a reduction in ambition. It didn't build on existing assets. And you have to wonder, was this even a constructive mistake? I mean, what were we thinking by that? What makes it worse is a few years ago, we were thinking of another investment in Chicago, and this story of Alfie became an urban legend. Nobody had kept any paper on it. All the foundations, they didn't have anything in their file, so it became a part of the environment that inhibited new kinds of investments. The final big challenge is a question of timing, and this timing issue affects local sites, the marketplace, the life cycle of organizations, communities, policies, administrations. I mean, we often say projects succeed or fail because of timing, but I think we need to do a much better job thinking through what the specific timing, what that means for individual investments up front. And for me, it's sort of a paradox. It's hard to know when a success is a success or when a mistake is a mistake. One of my chapters looks at what I call sector-based or industry-focused workforce development over 30 years. And sometimes it's a success, sometimes it's a failure. Evaluations show this, evaluations show that. How do you stick with good ideas that just take time to develop? How do you exit from bad ideas early enough? That's a difficult challenge. There's three recommendations the book makes, and let me just go over these quickly. The first is social psychologist named Gary Klein has come up with something he calls a premortem. I mean, we all know how to do postmortems, or sometimes we do. But a premortem is really training ourselves better to do risk assessments before we go out with an investment. And these are, there's a set of questions that we ought to ask. And the purpose of this is not simply to create a checklist, it's actually to train ourselves, to train our intuitions about what's working, what's not working, what to look out for, so that we're increasing the probability that we might actually catch something in mid-course and make an adaptation. It's somewhat easy to look at mistakes when all the dust is cleared. Much harder when you're in the middle of implementation, and yet that's when we want to have a better sense of what's working, what's not working. Secondly, we need to really work to change the culture around mistake sharing, and I call these mistake potlucks. We're doing them at Casey, and we've done them with other foundations, where we actually, with program officers, bring our mistakes around the table and share them. And what's interesting is not just talking about the mistakes, but actually there's a lot of implicit knowledge about how we do work in philanthropy in particular that we don't put on the table with each other. I mean, I don't know if you've seen it, but there's no manual that's really convincing about how to be a program officer. A lot of it's in the experience of people doing it every day. This offers one way to do that. Now, the best stories, in my mind, are where they're long enough where we learn something and we get better at it. The purpose of mistake stories is not simply just to document or out failures and hold responsibility. We want to tell stories as well where we can really understand how people acknowledge the failure, how they intervened, and how things worked out. Now, this may not happen the first time around. That would be too hopeful. But at least we're prepared for the second time around. And then finally, leadership really matters in saying it's okay to talk about mistakes. And Paul Bress, former CEO of Giloth, really paraded quite a model for doing that. And I think the quote is important. It's important when we talk about mistakes to also, and this is important for philanthropic leaders, to say how we share responsibility. There's a temptation sometimes for philanthropy to point at its partners and say, well, you failed, we had a good idea, but you didn't do it. And I think that shared responsibility has to be part of this whole process if we really want to use mistakes fully. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor of mistake success. It's a small initial effort. We plan we want to create some tools. There'll probably be a website on this. There is a good amount of fear about talking about mistakes, but that's matched by a lot of interest of people who maybe have held back their mistake stories and not found an audience they can share them with. So let me stop there, and I'd be glad to be part of a discussion as to this topic. Great. Super.
Great, I guess I'm up next. I don't know if there's a implicit metaphor by bringing a Canadian on a panel to talk about failure or mistakes. But I got into the mistake business by starting a nonprofit, and you actually can't start anything and not make a whole lot of failures and be faced with them on a daily basis. And I think that was a real genesis. The genesis of Engineers Without Borders Canada 10 years ago was very much a process of failing a whole lot, progressing a little bit, and having a lot of faith that the future would be better than what we just experienced. And I think that that's actually quite a normal thing for nonprofits. I think it's quite a normal thing for for-profits. I think it's quite a normal thing when you're starting out anything, whether it's an organization or a venture or project. And it informed, and being quite reflective in our early years, it informed the culture of Engineers Without Borders as we tackled issues around international development. And the international development space is a very interesting one on a variety of dimensions in terms of failures and mistakes, and also what success looks like. And I want to start off with a story that will demonstrate a little bit about why I think this is interesting and why Engineers Without Borders Canada has ended up with a culture of embracing failure as a very central part of the organization and how we work. And we're trying to spread that culture, and I want to finish off by talking a little bit about what that spreading of having a failure culture, which is kind of a strange thing, what that looks like. So I'll take you back about 18 months ago, and I was traveling to Malawi, which is a small sliver of a country in southern Africa. And it's a place that we had been working for about 4 years or so, but it was my first visit to Malawi. And in particular, one of the areas that we were working in, or one of the sectors that we were working in, was the water sector. And clean water is a very emotional, I think it's a sector that I think connects with a lot of people for a variety of reasons. And it's incredibly important to communities to have clean water for a variety of reasons, including health effects and the results of having better health. And so getting clean water in rural Africa is quite critical, and there's been substantial investments over the years. I arrived in particular in this one area of Malawi called Cholo. And it's a community or a cluster of communities that probably has about 100,000 or 200,000 people, somewhere in that range. And to give you a sense of this area, it's sort of these rolling hills that are very lush in areas, particularly where there's tea plantations, and that are less lush in anywhere where there's not a tea plantation and where people are living very, very simple, very in some cases, vulnerable lives. And to just put it in context, you have about 15% of kids dying before the age of 5 because of either malaria or diarrheal disease, or in some cases, tuberculosis. So it's a very poor area, and there's lots of challenges. I was arriving in Cholo in particular because I was going to be taking a look at a gravity-fed water system that was installed over, I think it was 2 years prior to when I got on the ground. It was installed over a 5-year period of time, and that the Canadian government had funded. And I was supposed to be looking at this as a project, a water distribution project that was typical. And what I saw on the ground when I went to the first community, and to give you a sense, and I won't be too technical or engineering-y about this, but basically what it was a gravity-fed water projects take water from springs in mountains and pipe that water down and then distribute it through a variety of different communities, usually with a variety of stand pipes. And you have taps that are community-based taps rather than household taps that people take water from. And so I went to this one community, arrived at this tap, and the water was working, and the kids were splashing water on their face, and it was a great picture that I could get of this water project that was functional. And I talked with a community member who was the chairperson of the water committee that was in charge of maintaining this infrastructure and in charge of ensuring that people were respecting it. And if I'd stopped there, everything would have been great. But later that day, what we did was we actually toured other parts of this project. And of this particular gravity-fed water scheme, there were 113 taps, and 81 of these taps were no longer working a year and a half after implementation had finished. And so while I saw the first success in kids splashing water, I then proceeded to go to a variety of other communities who were on the same project and see failure. And failure where spigots had been stolen or valves had been stolen. I saw failure where pipes that were further up the system had broken and not been repaired for a variety of different reasons. I saw failure where I would talk to somebody who was ostensibly part of the water committee, but they told me that the water committee quickly disbanded after a year, even though there's still a chairperson for the water committee. They don't actually meet, so it's not really a committee. And I saw a variety of these real challenges with this water project. The other thing I saw, and I remember in this one village that I was in, and it was quite remarkable, was I saw very close to where this Canadian-funded, Canadian engineering organization company, it wasn't us, Canadian engineering company implemented project was situated. And literally 30 feet from each of these water taps, I discovered a very similar piece of infrastructure that looked almost identical. It had concrete, a concrete slab, and most of them didn't have spigots, but I discovered this because one of them had the remnants of an old spigot. And so I started asking about this. I started saying, what's this? This looks really similar. And he said, oh, that's the American-funded project that was implemented in the late 80s and 90s. I said, oh, really? And so I started inquiring a little bit more. And I found out that, in fact, there was originally an American-funded gravity-fed water distribution system. And it had precisely the same design, almost exactly the same implementation. In fact, when the Canadian engineering company was building this, they reused the trenches, the old trenches for the pipe, and built out exactly the same system. And I asked, well, what happened with this American one? They said, oh, well, it failed about a year and a half after it was installed. And so literally the remnants are sitting there. You can actually see them, and yet you still have that type of failure. And I actually looked into this a little bit more because I really wanted to understand what was happening here. Did anybody see this? Did anybody understand it? Why wasn't this identified earlier in the process? And in fact, what I understood eventually was that it was, and it was ignored, or virtually ignored. About halfway through the implementation of the Canadian-funded project, you had an interim evaluation that identified all of these problems. The implementer and the funder got together and they talked about it, and there was a report back and forth. And then it was put on a shelf to gather dust. And nobody talked about it because there was no incentives to be able to actually talk about that failure and address it and look it in the face and do something about it. And it's a great example for me of, certainly in the international development space, what happens with failure is that it's quite hidden. And in Bob's book, I think he talks about this a lot. It's this notion that there's this treasure trove, I think the word you use, this treasure trove of mistakes and innovations that are completely silent, and they're completely out of sight in many cases in international development. And they stop both lessons from mistakes from being repeated, and they also prevent innovation. And so with Engineers Without Borders, to give you some quick context of where this story actually goes, we were on the scene because one of the things that we see in the water sector in Africa and in a lot of other sectors is you have a lot of this outside funding and a lot of outside implementing organizations that just frankly don't invest a lot in local capabilities. So they don't work with local governments, they don't invest in those local governments for operations and maintenance. And one of the things that we were trying to do as an organization and continue to try and do in Malawi is to invest in those local governments to be able to actually manage infrastructure, manage projects, to be able to innovate on their own, and to be invested in, and to prove that these local organizations can work really well. And in doing so, we've made lots of mistakes. And the Malawi example where we got engaged is a great example of lots of mistakes that we made in being able to look at how to address the more macro mistake. And the lots of mistakes that we made were very micro in nature. One of the major problems we saw, or reasons we saw why projects like this could happen that I saw, was that local governments weren't involved in planning. And they weren't involved in planning because when somebody showed up to actually plan a water project, they had very little to offer. They had no data on where existing water was. They had no data on what community needs were. And they had no ability to help guide outside people on making better decisions on what those investments would be. And so we decided that we were going to tackle that problem by helping these local governments get data on where water points were, what they looked like, what community needs were, and to have that data in a form that they could utilize to make decisions. This is not sexy stuff. This is like really behind the scenes. Like, try and sit down with a donor that you're trying to convince in Canada and tell them, you know what we're going to do with your money? We're going to build spreadsheets at municipalities in Africa. And it's not as sexy as building water pumps, but it's extremely important in order to have functioning water pumps. But in doing this, one of the things that we wanted to do was really get on the ground and say, okay, how would a municipality collect data so that this type of gravity-fed water project this mistake couldn't happen again? And so we said, okay, the first thing we'll do is we'll go out there and we'll send people off with a checklist and get them to collect this data. And we'll give them a financial incentive to do so. And our volunteer who is in the field and who he's been actually there for about 3 years. I think you kind of cease being a volunteer at that point. But he was out in the field and he got this great data, and he basically had this fantastic data set by giving financial incentives and working closely with people on where about 900 water points were within this district. He went to try and do this at another district and really evolve it. Came back 3 months later, and they were supposed to recollect this data every 3 months. And without the financial incentive this time, they had collected about 50% of the data. He sort of looked at that, said, well, not great, but he was working on something else, went out, came back another 3 months later at the 6-month mark, and they had actually ceased collecting any data. And so even as we were trying to address this macro failure, we were seeing at a micro level some of these challenges on how do you actually do this. And one of the major problems was we created a financial incentive where a financial incentive wasn't going to continue. It's kind of a bonehead error, but you're on the ground there, you want to make stuff happen, $20, make stuff happen. And so you go for it. And the important story, or the important part of this story, is that learning was internalized into the way that we actually run this project. And numerous other micro-learnings on this exact same thing were internalized into how we are working with the water sector in Malawi. Learnings like, rather than collecting data on every single water point, collecting data on a village and how many water points are working and not working in that village. Because you can imagine if somebody comes into a village from one direction at one time, they count water point number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If they come in from this direction, they count water point number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so the data actually becomes inaccurate if you're collecting on a water point by water point basis. But if you collect on a village basis, then you actually get much more accurate data. The reason that I'm telling these stories that are quite detailed is because it's those micro innovations and the learnings that come from them and the failures that were associated with those that we made very front and center in EWB that got us to the point where we actually have this program in Malawi that is now we're actually able to scale it to a country level where every district is going to be able to have this data-driven planning process that actually works, that doesn't require us being there, and that can be sustained. And I also use this example because I think it really relates a lot to what I read when I read the book, which is that micro matters. And we often forget about that, especially when we're talking about things at scale. It's that those very small details and the ability to have the organizations that we are a part of have the culture to focus on those details incessantly and constantly be learning from them and have the feedback loops within the organization to learn from them really, really well. And it certainly came out and was a central feature of all of the stories that I read throughout the book was that notion of micro innovation and micro failure and the culture within these organizations that allows you to use that micro failure and make it into something more useful. The other kind of theme that I took and certainly have felt within Engineers Without Borders over the years is what I call this failure innovation paradox, which is that if you actually make failure fairly visible and talk about it a lot, it can enable innovation because it makes more people very comfortable with this notion that it's okay to fail, and so I'm all right trying. But what it can also do is actually have the opposite effect, which is actually stifle innovation by compelling people to want to really think through everything to great depth before they act. And if I had done that when we had the conception of Engineers Without Borders, I never would have started Engineers Without Borders. There's no chance. I think that the notion of doing a premortem is a really good one. I would worry if those premortems had the effect of actually stifling people from even trying or stopping people from even trying. And I think we've seen that in our organization is finding the balance of that tension is actually very, very challenging to do. And it's something that I think as we sort of move forward and look at embracing failure, I want to start to understand a little bit better, and perhaps we can even chat about today. I'll quickly talk a little bit about this failure culture at EWB and admittingfailure.com, which is something that we've just launched. So with Engineers Without Borders, first of all, how many of you either run organizations or in leadership roles at organizations? Quite a few. So one of the things that we did fairly early on with EWB is we admitted our failures quite publicly. And we actually had a section of our annual general meeting where myself and our co-founder would stand up, and it was the failure. It was the failure part of our annual general meeting. And it was important from both a connecting with our base. We involve a lot of millennials in EWB, and they expect authenticity. In fact, they demand authenticity. And so it was an element of connecting, but it was also an element of maintaining a sense of humility. Because I don't know how many of you have ever stood in front of 500 people and talked about how you screwed up in a lot of detail. But it really creates a sense of humility and an understanding of sort of what that failure meant and what it looked like. It hurts to do. And so you start to internalize that and start to understand what that feels like and how to understand that a little bit better. And you start to create that culture within your organization where people are open to talking about failure, and they're excited about talking about failure, and are excited about sharing it with other people. And that's really where our failure report came from. And in fact, it wasn't me, and it wasn't any leader, any formal leader within EWB who created our first failure report. It was our staff in the field who said, we're screwing up a lot, and we want lots of other people who are staff in the field and Engineers Without Borders knowing about these screw-ups so that they can learn from it. So we're going to create a failure report. And in fact, they brought it to our annual general meeting and printed it out and surprised us with it, which was a wonderful gift. And I hesitated for about 2 seconds, and then I said, you know what, this is absolutely genius, and we need to be able to support this. And we've increasingly institutionalized it. This year it's kind of glossy and pretty, but it's something that we really are embracing as an organization, and it's just the start. The second part of actually creating a report is to institutionalize the process of collecting failures, learning from them, articulating what our organizational knowledge is, and how we actually feed that forward into future actions, which we are, I would say maybe a 7 out of 10 on right now, and which leaves a lot of room for improvement. But it got us thinking, what would it take for others in the sector, in the international development sector, which has some unique challenges, unique feedback challenges, in that there's not a lot of feedback mechanisms back to donors because projects are happening a whole long way away from where the money is usually coming from. And so what would it look like if you actually created this culture within the international development community from funder all the way down to implementer? And that was really where admitting failure came from. Admittingfailure.com is going to be a platform that we've developed, and we're going to co-develop with a number of others to collect failures from around the international development community with the desire to be able to have and shift that culture where talking about failure, where admitting it is important and useful, and where it's accepted and much less scary, but also to actually collect these lessons in a way that makes them useful and allows some of those similar types of errors that have been made in the past not to be made in the future, but also that enables innovation by creating a space where people can talk about these micro failures and micro innovations and be able to build off of each other, almost like researchers do at universities when they're constantly in touch with each other in research groups. And so that's the notion of admittingfailure.com. And the really interesting thing about it is whenever we've told anybody about this up until since we launched it, which was about a month and a bit ago, we've gotten nothing but positive feedback. We've had none of our donors say, we're not giving you any money. In fact, we've had donors come up to us and say, we want to give you more money. And when we send our failure reports out to our donors, they say, wow, I know you're failing. It's great that you're actually admitting it. And it means that you guys are a serious organization. And so actually admitting our failure has done the opposite of what everybody fears, which is that it's actually attracted more resources. It's attracted more energy. It's attracted more people. And I can tell you for this next generation, this millennial generation coming up, they're actually not going to accept anything less than this. There's a different authenticity that exists among the millennials that they demand. And that as a sector, I think we need to really, as an international development sector at the very least, and maybe even as a whole nonprofit sector, we need to understand a lot better. I'll probably leave it there. Other than finishing up that original anecdote about Malawi with a very quick and poignant extra piece to it, which is that as I was preparing for this talk, I said to myself, I wonder if that project in Malawi could have been anticipated. Not just the Canadian one, but I wonder if the American one. So I did a variety of Google searches, spent about a half an hour, dove through the USAID website, and came across a report that was written in 1981. And it was based off of a variety of water projects in Malawi. And the number one conclusion in the lessons learned section, which was of course buried in the middle and very difficult to find, number one conclusion was, if you're going to have successful water projects, you need to spend an equal amount of dollars and intellectual energy on the infrastructure, the infrastructure at a district government capacity level. So these are spreadsheets, as you do on the actual infrastructure of the water projects themselves. And so all of the lessons, I think, in many cases are out there, or many of them, and we just need a better way to figure out how to heed them and feed them forward. So thanks so much.
Hello. So it sounds like everybody's starting by saying how they got into the mistakes business. So I'll play along too. And I got into the mistakes business by raising children. And I don't mean that raising children is a mistake, but that if you're a parent, mistakes are kind of an hourly occurrence. So I want to start by telling a little story that was on my mind when I was thinking about mistakes. And as I read this book, it occurred to me. And so of course it relates to my kids because I like to talk about my kids. So my 10-year-old, somehow this happened, my 10-year-old is a really gifted drummer. He's a really, he's this little short Jewish kid, and he just rocks it out on the drums. So we enrolled him in something called the School of Rock, which allows them to perform in band configurations and do real shows. And we found out that not only is he a great drummer, he's a really good bongo player. So who knew, right? So he had his first performance coming up. We were very excited. We sold lots of tickets. We showed up and we realized that we had forgotten the bongos. So this was a bongo emergency. And not only was it bad because he was just so good, he was going to be in the show and participate, but he had a bongo solo in the song Brick House. So if anybody knows the song Brick House, that is a great song. So we were an hour away from home and we didn't have bongos. So we were faced with a dilemma. Do we just make him learn his lesson and say, next time you'll remember to bring the bongos, or you'll remember to remind us, or did we drive back and get them? If you have kids, you probably know that we drove back and we got the bongos, right? But what was sort of important to me about that, this is the way I rationalize it, was that we didn't sort of have this knee-jerk response to the fact that he made the mistake of not bringing the bongos, but we, used that to say, next time you'll bring the bongos. So it's really, sort of the application to this issue of mistakes is sort of, the difference between a knee-jerk punishment to the act of doing it and reflective behavior modification based on the experience of it. And so, I really think how you respond to mistakes is really how you perceive mistakes. It's correlated to that. So if they're bad, if they're a sign of weakness, of incompetence, of unworthiness, then you sort of hide them, you're embarrassed. We talked about that already. You get embarrassed, you take it personally, and then you hide it. But if you know how to learn from your mistakes, you sort of shrug your shoulders, you modify your behavior, and you move on, and you do something differently. So, my point with that story was not just that I have a rocking kid, which I do, but that the world is a complicated place. Mistakes are inevitable in any, human effort. And I think particularly in cases where we're working with lots of other people, with lots of other human beings and other organizations to address, as Bob's great schematic with all the medical issues showed, very, very complicated problems. And this is what our sector sort of faced with when we're thinking about failure. So it's how we respond to those stumbles and what we do after them that sort of makes the difference in how we make the world better. So in terms of foundations, we're here to talk about foundations in particular, I think. And yes, I think it's true that they don't broadcast their mistakes or program failures as much as might be useful, but I do really think they know when they make them and they try to learn from them. So I have a little story about that I'll tell later. And I want to talk about the book for a minute, because I really think it was a good book. And I'm not just saying that because it was available for download on Amazon.com, which was extremely helpful. Thank you for that. So the premise that foundations and their grantees don't share their failures enough, or either with each other, between grantees and foundations, or with the public, in ways that could really help us improve our approaches to whatever social good we're trying to achieve, is definitely true. And I've already heard it said up here, we lack a culture of acceptance of mistakes. And we don't really have safe mechanisms to do it, right? So nonprofits are pressured to raise money. They have multiple funders. So if we admit something didn't work, will the money disappear? Or will the funder give us space to learn, to modify, and to reapply for the funding again? We're working off, yearly 1 to 3 year grants. Will the money be there the next time if we actually admit to some failure? So I want to tell a little story about something I just heard in the last 2 days that I think is a little telling about how foundations and program officers at foundations do think about failure. I was in a large meeting convened by a major foundation of a set of their grantees to discuss the foundation's new framework for change. It was a sort of this new big framework. It's very exciting. It's great. We heard a lot about their new measures of success, and then when I raised my hand and I asked the question, because I was doing a little field work for today, I raised my hand and I said, okay, well, what might failure look like for this new framework? And the speaker said directly to that the board has shared with the program staff that they want to see return on investment, dollar for dollar, of the grants made. Dollar for dollar return on investment. So think about the pressure that puts on foundation staff who are creating these new programs that they really believe in, that they really are emotionally, personally invested in. They're invested in their portfolios, they're invested in their careers. And so when a board tells them that and they have to sit in a meeting and then report on findings, they're not, they're going to they want to focus on what they did right, not what didn't work well. And this person she's been in the field for a long time. She's really, really smart. And she said directly, we're not successful as a foundation if our grantees fail or go out of business. So then my thought is, well, where do risk and innovation and frankly just being a human being, where do they fit into this sort of directive that program officer is being given by her board? So of course then there's the whole constraint I already mentioned. There's sort of that timing constraint. So many of us, and I count the Council on Foundations in that, but many nonprofits receive grants, program grants for a year, maybe 2, maybe 3. And so what can you really know? What can you tell them about the effect of that grant? It's hard enough to know even how effective it's been, let alone if something didn't seem to go right, what the reason was. That's a tricky challenge for us as nonprofits. I want to tell another slightly different story about how a foundation did learn from mistakes and really acknowledged and kind of embraced what they found. A program officer at another foundation shared with me that one of his grants for sort of health education at an organization that serves immigrant communities had really not worked at all. It just was misguided. They weren't ready. It was sort of a failure. It was a little disappointing. But what they found very soon after was that this group, because of this grant, suddenly had the capacity to help the communities who were affected by the Gulf oil spill. Like they could just jump right in there and work with the communities because they had gotten enough operating support from this grant. And I could tell from my conversation with him that the foundation would have seen this as a failure if they hadn't taken sort of a broader view that success can be unintended But when the mission is to improve lives, not just to sort of reach evaluation targets, then mistakes can be wonderful. I wanted to mention that something that we did at one of our recent conferences, and I think it shows that there is sort of a new respect for among grant makers to share their failures. I think it's sort of the pendulum is swinging that way. I think the sort of reduced endowments and the belt tightening of recent years has really helped with this. But there's sort of interest in literally talking about their worst grants as Paul Brest is sort of out there with it. But we had at our family philanthropy conference last month, we had a session called Bombs and Brilliance. That's kind of like the Bob's potluck idea. And 21 philanthropists, and these are family members in some cases, so this is their money, they think of it as their money. They each got a minute to describe their worst grant they ever made and the best grant they ever made. And that's something. I mean, it's just there is a new willingness, I think, among foundations to talk about when things go wrong. Another thing I wanted to compliment Bob on the book about was that there was sort of a minimum of what I'd call philanthrospeak. There weren't very many acronyms, so good job on that. I think that in particular, what I found, one of the ideas I found really special that he didn't talk about was sort of this idea that best practices in the nonprofit sector is like the smart car or the catnip of the sector. It's one of those things we've all like to talk about, but it's sort of the opposite of not acknowledging or learning from mistakes. It's this bad habit of sort of saying that any new idea that's sort of sexy or intriguing or promising, but not necessarily proven effective, is still a best practice. And so I just wanted to highlight and thank him for this idea of sort of developing a shared system of promising versus good versus best practices based on data and track record. And I actually, was looking for things as I read this book of what could foundations be helpful with. And this is something that a foundation that is focused on, creating the environment for nonprofits to do their work better, and there are many of them out there, they could help make that happen. One thing I felt like I wanted to hear a little bit more about, or that I didn't feel like the book got to the heart of an issue that I actually do consider very critical, is that you hinted at it, but didn't sort of go deeply into the fact that nonprofits are funded by a multitude of players, and of course, as we know, the biggest of them is government. So they often they not only get funded by a multitude of players, they also work with a multitude of players, and sometimes with a government agency. So sort of just the time that it takes for nonprofit staff to report to these various funders using their reports, their algorithms, their online submission vehicles, just that takes a lot of time. And so it sort of raised questions in my mind about, well, if a program doesn't work, who do we tell? Do we tell all the funders? Do we tell some of the funders, the funder just of that particular component? Again, it sort of gets back to this, it's complicated. So I think there's an opportunity here to talk about sort of how you develop those systems. Also, if an organization is working in partnership with others, whose fault is it? I mean, how do you decide who's to blame or who has to fix it? I mean, who's to blame? I'm being a little flip, but I mean, if there's some kind of fix that's required, who has to fix it? And that has, potentially not just sort of political issues, but it also has potentially financial issues if somebody has to go in and clean up. Obviously, social problems like poverty and hunger are not, they're not all being solved in one fell swoop. They're iterative. They're being iteratively addressed. So sort of that we're back to that. It's complicated, and the process of parsing out and learning from mistakes should be a careful and sort of a hopefully neutral one that I think, again, foundations who are supportive of the infrastructure could play a role in beginning these conversations or having these conversations. And not just because they can give the space or sort of the financial support for a convening, but they have a lot to share intellectually. I mean, both government and private foundation funders have a lot of experience with sort of how to fit all the pieces of the puzzle together. They do that when they develop their programs, and so I think it has application here to sort of thinking through how do we start talking about working on mistakes. Another thing I just wanted to mention quickly was I really like the book's focus on innovation and sort of its potential to continue in a sector, especially with foundations and nonprofits, that's sometimes too focused on evaluation and outcome measures and metrics and logic models. And sort of how do we, and we also heard from our engineer. Are you an engineer? Okay. We heard from our engineer that, that innovation is key. And so I really liked how the book sort of talked about how we reconcile innovation with the real need for program evaluation. And I know that Bob already talked about the Wright brothers example, but I loved it because essentially he reminded us there was no single light bulb. There was no like ding, and they went out to the beach and they created a plane and it flew. It took years of precise documentation of failures and redos before they made a plane that can fly. And so, but obviously it's sort of one of the biggest innovations. So I just wanted to read a quote from the book, actually, which I thought was really useful. I don't know what page it's on because I have an ebook, so there are no page numbers. It was a little confusing. The Wright brothers' most significant contribution was the learning process that helped place high value on understanding why things went wrong. So innovation doesn't occur in a vacuum. It requires deep understanding of how things can and have gone wrong, and then sort of developing the path forward based around avoiding those things in the future. The nagging question that sort of left me with, and I'd love to talk about it here, put it out to you smart people in the audience, is sort of how do we remove the stigma from admitting mistakes in the nonprofit and philanthropy fields? Sort of how do we create that failure acceptance? I forgot how we talked about this failure culture. One thing that struck me was that in the private sector, businesses die all the time. And in a sense, I think there are a lot of entrepreneurs who have sort of wear a badge of honor if they've been at the helm of some startup that's just completely gone down in flames. It's sort of a cool thing. But that's, I don't think, the case in the nonprofit sector. Designed risk like that, there's controlled risk. Designed risk like that is something to avoid because we're worried about looking like we're playing with money, that we're playing with donor money or members, in our case, members' money or taxpayer money. We're afraid that if the risk doesn't pay off, the money won't be there again. And that's really the case for foundation program officers as well. I mean, they have to make the case for their budgets every year. And if something didn't go right, will they get that money? Will they get to sort of give away the same amount of money that they got to give away last year? So how do we make it okay? How do we make iterative learning like the Wright brothers process something that's encouraged, informed, and structured? I like the sort of humility culture idea. I was thinking about that even just for my organization. Sort of how do we not just be rah-rah? How do we talk about what's not working? So I think the answer, I don't have an answer, but I think that there are multiple funders of nonprofit activity out there who might really be able to begin talking, encouraging conversation about this in a real way. And they have a level of influence that could make it possible to engender this conversation. I had an idea that maybe instead of asking on the forms that you have to send in to the funders, instead of asking, how will you define success? And this is a frequent thing in grant proposals. And I'd love to sort of see what would you consider failure and what will you do about it? And I know that's really ominous, but it's, someone has to kind of start this, sort of plant the seed. Like Engineers Without Borders, you're filling a role of actually having this conversation. I think someone has to just kind of put themselves out there and start thinking about this. So I don't really think that social change occurs without risk. I mean, it just doesn't seem possible to me. And I know that not all foundations are in the business of social change. They don't see that as their role necessarily. But, lots of small family foundations fund things like music in schools. And so when they give a set of bongos to a child who then takes that set of bongos and just, develops incredible self-confidence because they can rock it out, they need to be, that small family foundation should be ready to kind of let themselves and whoever they give the bongos to sort of feel ready to try something new, to try it without embarrassment, to try it without fear of disinvestment, and to sort of try it without fear of silence if that solo doesn't go well. So anyway, thank you.
Okay, I agree with everything that's been said. We'll move on. All right. I'll just follow the opening that Rachel gave. Since I've made a lifetime of professional mistakes, I'm eminently qualified to be on this panel. Because it was interesting reading the book that some of the book chapters actually deal with community economic development. In fact, the whole book is community economic development, which is my field. I've been in that field for 40 years. and the chapter particularly on Eastside Community Investments. Not only did I do the original audit of ECI, and I got booted out of the community by the foundation because the foundation didn't want to hear that we had declared the failure there. So there was a slight problem with the foundation's openness to that. But the one of the citations is a report called Durable CDCs. Actually, that was a program I created when I was a vice president of LISC, Local Initiative Support Corporation, but I called it tanking CDCs. And I was told, no, you can't talk about CDCs failing, you have to talk about succeeding. So there's a slight problem with this concept. But anyhow, in talking about, of course, foundations, I'm sure that for all the foundations in the room, because of my experiences having led the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, many foundations think that my philanthropic career is one of the mistakes. So I do have some experience in this, though. I used to work for the Institute on Man and Science as well, which was cited in the book at some point. And I remember a program we had at IMS where we were talking about embracing failure. And so we all tried to brainstorm our biggest failures. And everybody brainstormed their smallest successes. And there's a tendency, even in some of the chapters, you see this concept of failure. You have trouble trying to find the mistake because you find people talking about the programs that didn't quite achieve what they intended to achieve, but they were pretty good anyhow, and there was something good. So I was a little bit more focused on the word that Bob helpfully used in the title, which is mistakes. And I'm going to focus, based on my career of philanthropic mistakes, I'm going to focus on the foundation part of this. And my perspective is to focus not on successes and not on less than successes, but on the real failures. And in this case, the failures that are potentially part and parcel of what some foundations actually do when the funders, because of their own grant-making predispositions or because of institutional prerogatives, actually create some of this dynamic. And I'm not talking about just evaluation of demonstration projects or experiments. I'm talking about the quotidian, day-to-day activity of foundations engaged in grant-making that are not structured like the kind of thoughtful, Annie Casey kind of, even when they're not thoughtful. I saw the eye roll there. But not the projects that are the demonstration projects, but the things that foundations do every day and looking at what the problems might be. And even with those, I have a fundamental critique. And it's partly from my view as having been a funder and an intermediary in community development, and often many times even looking at projects where you have foundation initiatives and you feel like rather than submitting a proposal, you're auditioning, you're reading a script, and you're auditioning and trying to figure out which role can I get cast for. And hopefully the foundation will write me into the script and I'll be able to be a participant. The reality is that sometimes foundations forget that these projects deal with people. They're just real people. All too often, many funders are motivated and they're excited, they're captured by the attractiveness of their idea, their vision for a community, their sense that outside the community, they have a model they've come up with or they've discovered that can achieve benefits far beyond what simply funding groups on the ground can do. And they forget that and this goes to the building up of infrastructure, which I thought was interesting from the Malawi case, that sometimes if you simply just give groups the money they need to build up or build out, you actually achieve a great deal, and you achieve the capacity to innovate in some ways that is very important. Sometimes foundations forget, and sometimes it's not all that evident in the book, and this is one of the weaknesses in the book, I think, is that behind the foundation grants, there are people and communities involved in those grants, and they can't be overlooked. In the search for synoptic leaps in innovation, in the kind of enthusiastic search for new and different solutions that will vault a community out of its malaise, and this is so much in community economic development that I've involved in, some funders fail to see that the best innovations occur when they invest in building community capacity and community infrastructure, when they invest in the ability of a community to identify, address, and commit to grappling with its own problems. There's a recent article, the latest issue of Democracy Journal, has two authors who wrote that the best role of government is to establish the what, the ideals and goals for society, but to devolve more and more of the implementation to a radical localism that embeds the implementation of solutions in the communities and in the infrastructure of those communities, the nonprofit and community-based infrastructure. But there's so frequently an attractiveness of social engineering from on high. that in some foundation-initiated community building and community economic development projects that I've seen, they underestimate the fact and ignore the fact that there are real people in those communities whose expectations are raised and dashed, whose ability to control their own destinies is promised and then shorted, whose potential access to foundation resources it's out there and then suddenly it's dismissed. And I think some foundations get overly taken with their social engineering prowess, and they forget about the community dynamic beneath it. And I have a very vivid memory of when I was at LISC. No, when I used to work for the Enterprise Foundation, actually. Before I was with LISC, I worked for Jim Rouse, who's a great creative genius. But I remember we went to one community where I watched Jim and a local funder in that community, and they talked about, well, we're going to make everybody housed. We're going to make everybody employed. We're going to make everybody healthy. And you will go, wait a minute, if you go into communities and say these things when you're dealing with essentially, even if you're a big foundation, if you're the Annie Casey Foundation, it's still micro money dealing with macro problems. And there's a tendency in the social engineering to basically forget that the results on the ground can be quite disheartening and devastating to real people. So I want to flag that. In fact, one of the examples I'll name names of foundations that have made mistakes. One of them is the Northwest Area Foundation. And I wrote 2 pieces on Northwest Area, and recently Northwest Area wrote its own report taking stock of a program called the Community Ventures Program, which was designed with the absolutely best of intentions. None of this is saying these evil foundations. These are programs with the best of intentions. But the program was an absolute failure. And not just an insufficient success, not just a little success. There's nobody in Northwest Area who will tell you, oh, that was a little bit of success. They'll tell you it's a complete failure. It involved protests against the foundation, involved litigation against the foundation, and essentially for overriding the indigenous structures and capacity of the community in doing the work. So in preparation for this session, rather than simply coming up with all the examples that I would come up with about philanthropic, failure to see community behind their grants, I contacted a few dozen people inside foundations, a few outside that were former grant makers, and asked them what they might see as how foundations recognize and learn from mistakes, and what they would actually think what they think foundations can do to create a culture of more sensitivity to their community context in which they operate, and what they can do to create an environment that really gets to some of the culture that I think Bob's book tries to get at. And I started with one comment that one of them gave me was basically, unless all foundations are full of deadheads, every foundation learns from its mistakes. The question is, what do they learn, and how do they deal with what they might be learning from those mistakes? It's not that what leads to experiments and pilots and demonstrations that don't succeed, is how do the mistakes affect and turn communities into petri dishes, and people in those communities into lab experiments that have to be looked at. So here's what they told me are the causes of the problem, and I'll give you what they told me might be some of the solutions for foundations dealing with this. The causes of the problem. First, the learning predispositions of senior management. They said that one of the problems is that there has to be a culture of learning if foundations are to be able to learn from their mistakes and recognize the mistakes as theirs. I'm fascinated by, we all cited the Hewlett piece and Paul Brett's imitation about a statement that the mistakes are shared. If you look at the evaluation that was done for Hewlett of the Comprehensive Community Initiative there, what's interesting about the shared mistake is the community was not ready for the intervention that Hewlett gave them. So wait a minute, that's an unusual version of shared. It's like, we had a good idea and our mistake was we thought you were ready and you weren't. So I get a little concerned when it comes to that. So foundations, if they're going to recognize mistakes, they have to be not getting carried away with the rightness of their ideas, in the sense that somehow the solutions to technical problems, to social problems, and community economic development is a social phenomenon. They're not lodged necessarily in neat technical solutions. The Gates Foundation, for example, is even learning on its technical side when it looks at vaccines and medicines in Africa. You can prescribe all the pills you want, but if there's not clean water to be able to wash the pill down, it becomes very hard to do that. So you need to invest in the infrastructure for the delivery of benefits, not just the technical innovation. Everybody in terms of the culture of the foundation said that it's near impossible to get honest feedback, and it's great that your funders are rewarding you for this. But in many cases, nonprofits are quite afraid if they admit mistakes, if they admit failure, they are not going to get funded. And despite the language that says, "Oh, we invite you to admit your mistakes," that doesn't really quite happen. Moreover, if you say to foundations, "The mistake is yours, foundation, and your grant-making strategy is," well, I won't use the word, you don't really get a warm reception in many foundations. And then particularly, and I think this goes to the Northwest area example, one of the things with foundation executives who have big ideas, there's a delight in current philanthropy of being contrarian, of saying my ideas are different than everybody else's, and that I am bucking conventional wisdom, so that when your grantees say, it's not working for us, it's not working in the communities, it's often easy to dismiss that kind of feedback as though those are those conventional wisdom thinkers, and I'm further ahead than they are. So there's a problem of the culture of learning. That's the first one. Second one is the over-promising the benefits of foundation ideas. I mean, this is my point about foundations as micro players, that you're really talking about micro money addressing macro problems, and often, in many cases, when foundations intervene in communities, they forget to see that people really have expectations that get raised and lowered quite quickly. Now, one of Bob's bosses, Ralph Smith, says that foundations should be in the solutions business, funding solutions to social problems wherever they might be found, in the nonprofit sector, the for-profit sector, and government sectors. But solutions to social problems are very hard to do with micro money. And this is where I think even foundations do themselves a huge, huge disservice. I've sat through many of these meetings where they debate how they're going to solve all these problems, even if the fact that in any one area, the local partners are virtually bankrupt and have almost no capacity to carry some of the stuff out. But community people see the foundation people come in with the clipboards. They see people like me doing interviews, because I'm a big interviewer when I do these innovations, and expectations go up. We call this creeping commitment, too. That foundations start mucking around in the community, and people think the big money's coming. Bob Giloth is talking to me. I know I'm getting the money. So there's this expectation issue that occurs as well. Third issue, people complained about dopey timeframes. And Bob's volume is very good talking about how hard the work is for social change, but foundations and many other funders as well want to see changes in impacts and outcomes in timeframes that simply don't make sense, particularly on social issues. So, here they often think they're funding technical solutions in economic development. They fail to take the longer view of the capacity that needs to be built to carry out economic development in a community context. So frequently, it's not just the fact that, and I think you had it in there, that foundations have short attention spans. Remember the TV show Short Attention Span Theater? I always think foundations were actually cast in that. But it's not simply their short attention spans. It's the fact that they have unrealistic views of what they might be looking for, and they pull the plug or declare something a failure because they don't have the institutional peripheral vision to see that there's really potential for success there. But they have to have a longer view for that. And that's why investments in the capacity of a community to address problems, which is a very long-term response, doesn't fit a lot of foundation social engineering, but it's actually very crucial to the building of success in communities. Fourth one, pushing evidence-based grant-making beyond the realm of evidence. And I love the comment you had about the how much planning you do and how much detail or thinking you can do. The concept I have is always Charles Abrams in the international development field, who wrote Development Projects Observed, which is a brilliant, brilliant book. Talked about the concept of the hidden hand of creativity. And to me, this is community economic development personified. If you try to imagine all the problems at the outset, on day one, you try to imagine all the problems that are going to be encountered and whether it's technically feasible to do half of the community projects that Bob and I have been doing for years, we wouldn't do them because we know you can't do them. It's impossible. There's no way these projects pencil out as feasible. But the hidden hand of creativity both allows you to sort of dismiss some of them or not know some of them, and your creativity helps you solve some of those problems as you encounter them. But if you don't invest in that capacity to develop that kind of creativity and to create the organizations that are going to be there to do this, you won't do it. You'll miss those great opportunities. I worry, and one of the foundation respondents said to me that they think that the Obama administration is pushing the evidence-based perspective beyond what's common sense, and that it leads to a process that is not looking at evidence-based planning. It's a process of creating a lot of work for academics, a lot of work for evaluation people on expensive contracts, and we start losing the idea of just picking grantees that have a sense of what they want to accomplish, some specifics about what they know they can do, and some sense of how they might adapt as they learn. So you're investing in groups that show the adaptive potential as opposed to they've thought about everything all the way along the line. In fact, I worry about this so much in the international aid perspective. One of the top contractors here in the U.S. that gets contracts from USAID just dropped all of its aid delivery programs simply to do program evaluation because it's more lucrative and a more reliable funding stream. So there's a problem with the evidence-based kind of structure. Fifth one, board culture. We often don't talk about boards. I mean, it's always been a problem in foundations. We don't talk about this. But the role of the foundation trustees is problematic to the foundation staff, because often the trustees have a quicker fix orientation than the foundation staff do. So they have even less patience for that long-term situation. One of the respondents told me she bemoaned the tendency of her board members to fund and fund again and fund again their favorite personal charities and friends, or the focus on personalities rather than on the organization and infrastructure of the community as a basis for supporting the community. And plus, she said that there's a focus of the trustees on new grant making. So because there's so much of a focus on new grant making, there's often a reduced ability to look at what are we learning from our existing grant making. In some foundations, it's often compromised. 6, they identified the power imbalance. Everybody here can point to the problem that foundations have significant power over their grantees, and that's trite. There's no news there. But it's exacerbated when foundations fool themselves to think that they are undoing the imbalance, by switching from funder to partner. In the Northwest Area Foundation project, that was the big concept, is that Northwest Area is going to be a partner to the communities rather than a funder. And they say, and the communities, the funders I got from that region told me that they found that switch unwittingly exacerbated the power imbalance. Rather than inducing community organizations to design and submit proposals for funding, by becoming a partner, Northwest Area was seen as the dominant player in the community organizations thinking about the design of their initiatives, and therefore they basically almost gave the decision-making process, the design process, to the foundation rather than kept it within their community. Northwest Area actually crafted new organizations to carry out its initiatives rather than building on top of or building off of the existing infrastructure. And although I give Northwest Area great credit that in retrospect they've been completely straight up with their result. They've been very, very candid about it. The reality is, in that region, that program, that Community Ventures program, is called the $100 million mistake, the $100 million disaster. And that's $100 million that people aren't going to see again in that community. So they may have learned something about bypassing the nonprofit infrastructure. It was a very costly lesson. And I have trouble calling that sort of a wonderful mistake to think about. It's further, many foundations exist on a class divide where they view themselves as somewhat better than nonprofits and their grantees, and therefore they basically think that they know best and so forth. And the last one, and I was fascinated by the incentive question, because the respondents I had said, the other problem is the foundation business model itself. And what's the incentive for foundations to learn from and avoid mistakes? One of the grant makers said that the problem is that many in our society, in the for-profit sector, organizations learn and try to learn from mistakes in order to be competitive. I mean, you're trying to basically make sure that your products stay ahead of the game and so forth. What's the incentive for competition in foundations that have no competitive incentive, have no base market measure? What presses 100,000 grant-making foundations, not the self-critical, self-analytical Caseys of the world, but what presses philanthropy to be digging into the process of learning? The business model of foundations is at its core, spending its 5% minimum distribution that's required, and making sure it does so and has a return on its investment so it doesn't dig too much into its corpus. So it's, you may have a Bob Giloth or somebody there who's basically pushing this kind of culture, but the business model is problematic. In fact, one former grant maker who I was sort of taken aback by said to me, spending money doesn't require learning at all. In fact, learning can be counterproductive for getting money out the door compared to the investment that foundations make in their investment strategies, comparing their earnings to other foundations, holding their money management people accountable for good investment results, changing money managers when they don't perform. It was almost an argument to think of, what if foundations put that money they spent on the investment side into the foundation learning side? And what a completely different kind of situation that would be. Let me quickly go to what they said the solutions would be. They said, one, inviting criticism. This isn't, it's not just the kind of evaluation feedback that is so common now where we say, well, are foundations responding to their phone calls quickly, and do they take 3 months or 2 months in terms of making their decision making? It's more a matter of having foundations really open up to inviting and asking their grantees and asking communities for feedback, for open critical feedback about what they're doing. And the debate among my respondents was whether or not big foundations or small foundations are better at this. I ended up with probably more small foundation respondents, and one of them said to me that I think a lot of our larger foundation colleagues, and she identified Ford, Kellogg, and Casey, could learn a lot from those of us who are smaller, who try our hardest to be good listeners first and foremost, and be willing to hear the good, bad, and the ugly, even if it relates to us. So I don't know how valid that is, but the question is, are the foundations actually inviting critical feedback so that they can actually know what's going on in the community and so forth? Secondly, I think we mentioned this, or somebody mentioned this, right-sized grant reporting. It's easy to say right-sized. The issue is grant reporting that encourages honesty and reflection. I've always written reports that way. I remember writing a big one for the California Endowment where I just said something that we had done at NCRP was a complete and utter failure based on a strategy that they had suggested we pursue. I never got a response back from them. I don't know why. It was like, let's discuss this. Let's figure out what we can learn. So they say that even with some foundations who are starting to build in these kinds of questions into their grant-making reports, they feel that nonprofits can't be as open as they should be, and if they do share, foundations will use that information that goes against any part of the strategy that is the foundation strategy. So there's an issue with the reporting. Third, letting nonprofits develop their own plans for action and letting them exercise self-determination. There's a tendency, again, to bypass community organizations, and it's important to basically build on their infrastructure for capacity. Fourth, learning through affinity groups for field learning. And the problem is you have affinity groups in this country, maybe 40, 50, 60, I've counted 72 affinity groups beyond those that are associated with the council. They should be great venues for that kind of, those mistake discussions that Bob talked about, but too many of those affinity groups operate as PR. PR for, here's the great things we're doing in our foundation, not for the internal learning that they might be. There's a great opportunity in the affinity groups, but my respondents were very critical of the affinity groups that turn into, as they say, show and tell PR versus any true space for reflection, challenge, and learning. And then fifth, do foundations change behavior as a result of what they're learning? How do you know a foundation is learning? You know they're learning something because they've changed as a result of it. If they don't change, what's the learning that goes on? So the question is, are foundations actually making changes that you can say, here's a foundation that learns because they are actually changing their behavior, changing their strategies, and taking their lessons to heart? And it's a rare kind of foundation that admits that. I'll give credit to Northwest Area Foundation. After looking at that big $100 million mistake, here's what they said, and I found these bullet points fascinating, and I'll end with this. They said that they had clearly misdesigned and misdirected the program. They said, we have returned to our roots as primarily a grant-making institution rather than designing and operating our own programs. Instead of initiating new community-based organizations, we will make grants to existing, proven, and promising organizations working to reduce poverty and build sustainable prosperity. We've embraced the need to listen well and conduct ourselves with humility, recognizing that the greatest wisdom about building prosperity resides in the community themselves and not within the not within the foundation. And we have committed ourselves to the idea that no funder can go it alone. We actively seek collaborative opportunities. and we are striving to communicate more clearly and more regularly with our grantees to articulate our mutual expectations more precisely. I thought that was a great summary of real learning where they say, we've changed and we will do this in the future. That's the kind of evidence of learning when you see a foundation make those changes and acknowledge them. So let me stop there at this point.
Well, off to a terrific start here. Running a little short on time, but let me pose, especially to George and Bob, a question, and it plays directly off Rick's comments about remembering that we're dealing with real people and real communities when we're doing these kinds of projects. Bob Woodson read the book and enjoyed it very much. You know Bob at the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise just down the street. A couple of his folks are in the audience. Bob asked this question. In our market economy, most innovation and problem solving emanates from small entrepreneurs who create more than 60% of the new jobs. According to Dr. David Birch, they tend to be C students. Why is this fact ignored in the social economy, where we rely upon credentialed professionals who continue to produce failures? Why not spend some of your energy exploring what is already working among the people suffering the problems, our social entrepreneur? And I think, as I say, I think the massive challenge that Rick poses to this approach is also captured in that question. So maybe if the two of you could sort of reflect on that for a second, that would be useful. And of course, anyone else jump in as well.
You know, I think that's a great comment. I know in our community building work across the country, in a bunch of cities, one of the things we've done pretty consistently that's always been a success, although it's had a certain amount of failures, is very small micro grant making in neighborhoods, where we literally make grants 200, I mean, almost like micro enterprise, 200, 500, 1,000, and really work with residents to administer those small grants programs over time. Now that's really a great way to start to figure out what are the assets, who are the entrepreneurs, who are the leaders. So I think that's a terrific idea. I mean, the other side of this, you know, Bob Woodson's comment about small businesses, they also fail 3 out of 5 times. So there's a tremendous amount of churning. So how do you support that and build it and turn it into the kind of outcomes you want? But I think it's a great idea. And if you want to do community-based work, you've got to not simply hold meetings. You've got to, that resource has to be available and to others in the community, and they have to be able to tie it to real things that they're doing on their block and with their church, with their school, and so on. So, great. Now, we probably, I say that, we probably don't do enough that way, but it's proven very successful.
George, do you want to? In other words, if you had gone to the village, right, before you built the Canadian version of the gravity water system, you would have seen, right, the concrete infrastructure already there, right? And so as a very blatant example of how it might have been useful to look at what was going on already, you know, you would have seen this structure there.
And I think for us, you know, again, there's some things that we do culturally as an organization, mainly because where we came from. You know, what business do engineers have to be in international development? There's sort of a humility associated with that that we had to recognize in ourselves right from the beginning, which suggested that this notion of credentials is actually quite beside the point. And what you need to do is you need to find the best ideas from where they come, and it pervades our entire organization of how we operate, right from how we hire, where we actually have a rule that we're not allowed to put a requirement for a particular educational credential on any of our job postings. It's just not allowed. We don't allow it because we want really talented people from wherever they come, even if they don't have a bachelor's degree, not mention a master's degree or a PhD. And it goes all the way down to how we actually invest in some of the work. And to me, it's not even so much sort of making that recognition that there's lots of ideas out there and figuring out how to find them, but it's saying what then becomes our role in incubating those ideas and allowing them to flourish and grow. And it's a very tricky thing, because it's you start to understand that if you're selecting from those ideas, you're bringing a bias. If you are investing in everything and then waiting for the best success to emerge, then you're bringing in a bias in terms of what you define as a success and on what time frame. And so it's actually not surprising that more people don't do it, because it's incredibly difficult to do. And if you take the small business analogy and extend it a little bit further, you actually have an entire industry that grapples with how you invest in small, promising businesses. You have angels and friends and family money and venture capitals, and you have VCs that specialize in different sectors, and VCs who specialize in meso funding, and then mezzanine funding, and then pre-IPO funding and post-IPO funding. And it's like you actually have an entire system that is figured out to a certain extent, even though they still have 60% failure, how to find and nurture these ideas. And I think in the nonprofit sector, I think one of the things that we need to do, and this is foundations and also people like us who are working close to the ground, is start to learn from other places on what is the best practice for finding those great ideas, not focusing on credentials, and figuring out how to incubate them and grow them and allow them to flourish from the ground up.
I just was going to add that I think that the issue with the system basically is that those who have credentials know how to play the system. I mean, they know how to work within the system. And so, and I think that's the case both with sort of government funding and with nonprofit funding, that, you know, there's sort of a system of grant proposals. I mean, once you've, you know, I've been writing grant proposals forever, and, you know, you just learn the language, and there's a sort of a programming piece of it that's key, and it's just accessed and sort of knowing the language that sort of gives you that access. So it's a bit of a bias.
Questions, please, from the audience. Yes, Martin.
Hi, I'm Martin Worcester. I know something about this subject. I wrote a book about it. I had a question for Mr. Giloth, who I know has read my book because I know he blogged about it. I was wondering. Yeah, thank you, Google.
But you did make a mistake. You cited him as Mark Worcester, so you should learn from that. Okay. But anyway,
I was just wondering if you all could talk for my book. If you could talk for a minute about how foundations discover mistakes and how they end programs. If I have the opportunity to quote myself, I say here, quote, "Indeed, the law of motion in foundations is that programs continue endlessly unless stopped by a significant outside force, such as a congressional investigation or a riot." I was just wondering if you could comment on it.
You know, we a lot of our grant making over the years has been structured as initiatives, and that may be worth discussing whether that's a mistake in itself. But those tend to be long-term efforts to accomplish a particular set of results, and they're time limited. Some of them actually do end. I came into the foundation to manage a jobs initiative. It was modestly successful. It had too many parts, and so we decided to unbundle the parts. The initiative ended. We've, went out and funded some of the pieces of it, but it ended. We're just ending something called Making Connections, which is a 10-year community building effort that is ripe with mistakes yet to be harvested. We know some of them, we don't know all of them, but that's ending. So we do it as a matter of course. Have we changed a certain grant-making style? Should we change from initiatives? Should we change from being a kids foundation? There's some broad macro kind of questions. I think would be harder. We're kind of stuck to a certain structure, but we're kind of reinventing it all the time. But we end stuff. It goes away. In fact, we have a part of the foundation called Transitioning Initiative, where there's a whole set of them that are transitioning out. And we've even developed the kind of foundation speak about how do you do responsible transitioning. So you're not simply saying, time's up, you're done, but how do you do it in a way that maximizes the, safe landing of the best stuff that you've done. So great, you're great. It's a great book, too. I really.
And it's available.
It's a new edition.
And it's the second edition,
Right.
yes. That's right. In the very back, please.
Thanks. This was a great panel. Well worth coming out on a chilly day.
Need to identify yourself and your institution, please. Sorry.
Michael Brown, Satya Development International, based here in D.C. A couple of points. I think the issue of feasibility that Rob started with is really the key. It's kind of the cornerstone and anchors sort of a whole culture of dysfunctionality that I would suggest prevails and is really difficult to change. And I think all four of the panelists touched really well on the topic, so I'm not going to repeat anything that was said, hopefully. But my suggestion is that if we skip quickly to Rick's point about capacity building, looking at community level people and so forth, and link it back across the foundation world and pumps and hand pumps in Africa and getting back to feasibility, the point that Rob made. I think that social feasibility in particular is lacking in analysis, and I think there is absolutely no. I did an article this past year that was published by a Canadian journal, a biodiversity journal, on social feasibility, and what I suggested is that social feasibility in the fields of natural resource management and conservation, in the international arena mostly, is completely disregarded. So, because social feasibility in particular, not just technical feasibility, but technical feasibility gets dealt with a bit better than the social side. Because social feasibility is not dealt with at all, projects are completely improperly designed. Programs are improperly designed and projects are improperly designed. And those are the projects that foundations are funding. And until there is a culture in the development world, whether it's community development in the US or community development in Africa, that demand that feasibility, both technical and social feasibility, drives the project and program design process, the whole thing is going to be bogus. I'm basing that comment on 30 years of work in designing projects in the USAID context in particular. Second point is an anecdote. I used to work for a nonprofit downstairs. I don't know what floor they're on, third floor, fourth floor. And I ran a NGO and community capacity building project in Africa for 8 years and dealt with a lot of hand pump issues. And the project was meant to strengthen the technical and institutional capability of NGOs and community groups across sub-Saharan Africa. There was 2 years of funding, 4, 6, and 8, funded by USAID. At the end of the period, and it was a demonstration-y type of initiative, at the end of the period, aid decided it didn't want to refund the project, and we said, okay, well, I said, and convinced the three institutional partners, World Learning Care and the World Wildlife Fund, why don't we do an analytical assessment to see what we achieved on a cognitive, behavioral, and biophysical level through our training, our information support, and our technical assistance. So we did an analytical assessment, and we did it with teams of Africans in Mali, Cameroon, Uganda, and Madagascar. It was one of the most fun things I ever did and one of the most worthwhile things I ever did. The document is available now online in USAID's DEC clearinghouse. My anecdote is the following. Not once from anybody, anywhere, any place, anytime, did I or the institutions I was associated with ever get a call about the failures that we discussed in that publication. That is available still online. I find that fascinating, and I think it's the point I want to make about that is I think that we're sort of reached a point where everybody, it's politically correct to talk about failure and to say, hey, we're interested in failure and we want to deal with it, we want to address it. But in reality, the economic pressures are such that people just don't really, at the end of the day, want to deal with it. Final point, for 8 years on the community level stuff, through USAID funding, mostly in Central Africa, I founded and ran an NGO for 10 years, no longer associated with that. But we were dealing with conservation work across massive landscapes in Central Africa. How do you conserve biodiversity? It was tied into a major initiative that's still ongoing in aid. And the question is, how do you involve community groups in conserving tropical biodiversity while at the same time alleviating poverty and promoting community level development? And we looked at methodologies in the shelf, and there really weren't, and there still really aren't too many methodologies that sort of empower people to sort of drive their own programming vision for what's going to happen. And we developed this thing called the Community Options Analysis and Investment Toolkit. Worked on it for 8 years. USAID funded it, and the anecdote on that particular story is nobody, even though I continue to use it in the work that I'm doing today, it's something that wasn't really picked up on, and sort of the experiences, whether they're positive or not, if it doesn't really fit into an institutional paradigm, whether it's a donor paradigm or a major NGO paradigm, people just don't really want to learn. There's a question I have about, are people really serious about learning? Final point, I'm in conversations now with a major foundation. I have a feeling
Real quick.
Yeah. Well, let me stop there. I'll talk to Rachel after about that.
No, and that's a good, actually, that's a good broader question, because we're out of time. So this will have to be our last sort of set of responses. But what I hear in that question is a it's a really terrific point, which is, the broader question of learning, and George's anecdote about being able to there was a piece of data out there that was available, had people taken the time to dig it out. But of course, we're piling up an enormous amount of information in all sorts of venues, in all sorts of forms, but there isn't the effort to learn in any systematic way from that piling up of information and the piling up of essays and studies and all this stuff. And I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but maybe you can reflect on that in this last go round from the panel.
I had two quick comments. I mean, one place we didn't get to in the book, because we had so many stories that were about a similar set of investment, workforce and assets, you could start fashioning hypotheses about what the field needed to learn about, because there's such a fragmentation that I think philanthropy promotes, but certainly public sector financing as well, where everybody's on a million different courses. But actually there's probably a more limited set of hypotheses that we all should be working on together. And I think it struck me that these stories kind of yield them up, and that we ought to spend some time on that. And that way you could actually focus where where some investments are. That's one response. I had another, but I forgot. So
well, we can come back to it. Anyone else on this?
I was just going to say that, not that many foundations have evaluation programs, and fewer have learning officers. Some of them do, but there's a difference between evaluation and learning.
Right.
And I think that's a critical difference. And so those who have learning officers are really lucky, because they have that historical knowledge, often in folks. And one thing that's going for philanthropy is that there are people with long tenures. I mean, it's hard to get into it, but people don't, unless they have to, they don't leave that quickly. So that is helpful, but it's important to, I think, either develop more the culture of learning at foundations, or the wall between between funders and grantees has to lower a little bit, because obviously there's significant expertise within the grantee community to actually sort of help the foundation develop that. It tends to be sort of foundation to grantee, sort of, here's our framework, you must love this, now go use it, as opposed to sort of the other way around. And so it really is, I think it's about changing culture a little bit. So.
Well, actually, I think there's a significant problem here. I mean, if anybody looks at the report that just came out of the committee, the congressional committee that looked at the financial crisis, what's striking about that is, and I've been saying this for a long time, is that we all knew the crisis was going to happen. We knew the subprime lending, or the evidence was there, the information was there, the ability to learn from that was willfully ignored, as opposed to a surprise like, gee, we didn't expect this. How? What a surprise! I mean, this was all predictable. In fact, there were some people, the Center for Responsible Lending and others, were writing this stuff in 2006 and 2005, saying we have to get ahead of this, and nobody did. I think there's a problem that goes back to your social feasibility question as well, and that is that we often focus on advances, on technology, on innovations, without the sense of not just the capacity of organizations, but the people behind them as critical elements of what we're doing. So as a result, we dismiss the learning because we're always going to find the next advancement, the next advance to solve a particular problem, to make a new synoptic leap into an innovation, as opposed to saying we have to look at the people, the organizations that are involved in carrying out these activities. What are they capable of doing? How are they structured to do this? Are we investing the right kind of capacity in them? And we might be able to avoid some problems rather than saying, how do we now recover from 4 million foreclosures and 2 million people having lost their homes right now? So I think we have some significant problems about dealing with mistakes, and even though we know it's there, and it does relate to the social feasibility question in a very broad way that I think is endemic in our work.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
Bob, I
in
know
a
you.
somewhat smaller venue, one of the problems I have with Obama's Social Innovation Fund is it kind of reflects philanthropy's need to sort of keep doing new things, or it didn't spend the time to sort of figure out what have we learned about replication. We have so many failures in replication. What do we learn about site capacities? Who can do these? I mean, all those things have not been really looked into, and there's a real opportunity to grapple with some of these feasibility questions and learning instead. And I've benefited from this with some of our projects. Instead, we have more money out on the street doing some very good things, but I think some of those questions have not been addressed, and I suspect there'll be a whole bunch of suboptimal replications of some pretty good ideas we might get.
Yeah, George. Last word.
I won't say too much, other than I think that what we've done in EWB is created the mechanisms to constantly remember how little we once knew, and also how little we know now. And we create those mechanisms because we have a lot of open feedback and conversations with people who are in the field and who know things and have an approach to learning about that. But we also have those mechanisms because we have a lot of people who are involved who are very new to international development. And when I go out still and sleep on couches across Canada and talk with someone who's 20 years old and is having their first exposure to what appropriate technology is all about, and you enter into that conversation again for the 150th time, you actually remember what it's like to learn, and I think that's really critical, and I think it's the piece that we've built into the mechanics of every piece of engineers at that border that I think could be useful also.
Very good. All right. Well, let's give our panel a round of applause for a terrific discussion.